Imagine that you are somewhere in creation that when you just think about it, it calms you, body, mind, and soul. Now imagine standing on the corner, not of Winslow, Arizona, but on the corner of Orange Grove and Gary Avenues, just north of the 10 freeway, just a little ways from here, where people don't know they're not supposed to turn left on a green light while they're getting on the freeway. It's a mayhem corner. Imagine that place for a moment. You know, the city is not a place we contemplate to step into the expansive presence of God, not usually at least. Thomas Merton, a spiritual teacher from the last century, once stood on the corner of a busy intersection in a city, and the sacred opened to him. He suddenly knew himself connected to everyone in his view. He suddenly knew himself to be part of the lives of all the people around him, unknown to him by name, yet known to him by heart. Merton spent most of his time in a quiet monastery in a rural part of Kentucky, apart from people, apart from cities. And here in the midst of the city, he encountered the presence of God. It is certainly easier for me to experience a sense of sacred presence while sitting on a granite boulder in the backcountry of the Sierra Nevada, but that's not the only place that God's presence can be found. Celtic spiritual thought, which we've been exploring these last 4 weeks, teaches that God's substance is in all of creation. The granite boulder that supports, the bird that sings, the insect that buzzes, leaves that rustle, and air that moves. God is in it all of it. Could it also be that God is in what human hands and minds have imagined and constructed for our own habitation? Could it also be that God is in the midst of this city? Not just the pretty cities with amazing architecture, clean streets, wonderful museums, and ample green space, but in the trash-strewn streets, among unsheltered people, along corridors of poorly painted businesses and potholed streets. It's harder to imagine the presence of God and experience what we think is sacred presence in these spaces. But God is in the midst of the city, even in the hard places, among hard-living people and among the people who look away. I want so much of these days of stay at home to escape the city. Go to the high desert or the Sierras and just be. There is a longing in me to be surrounded by the quiet in that space and wrap it around me like a blanket. And I am fortunate enough to have a large yard with lots of garden to tend, flowers that surprise me with beauty, sounds of bird song every day, well, underneath the jets, but sounds of bird song, and shimmering leaves. It is a challenge to find God in the midst of the city. And yet I find myself incredibly defensive on behalf of the city and the city in which I live when people turn their nose up at it. They say this all along the Highway 395. I hate LA, and by LA they mean all of Southern California. Maybe not San Diego, but all of Southern California. I really want to say back to them, well, you know, Los Angeles people keep your economy running by coming up here to kayak and hike and fish and lots of other things. So you can live in this rural haven. But instead I smile and mostly I don't say anything. But now it's out there on the internet. There you have it. It's easy to bash the city. That's easy. City bashing is something people do even to their own city and to neighboring cities. When people find out we live in Pomona, it's not unusual to see a lip curl and hear these words said disdainfully, "You live in Pomona?" Some of you heard me tell this story. I was about 9 years old, riding in our 63 Chevy Impala station wagon on the 10 freeway, through smog. I don't think the visibility was even a quarter of a mile, and I looked out the windows and I said, "Where are we?" My dad said, "We're in Pomona." And I said, "I'm never going to live in Pomona." And here I am, living in Pomona, serving in Pomona, finding God in the midst of the city. God is our refuge and strength, a very present help in trouble. Therefore we will not fear, though the earth should change, though the mountains shake in the heart of the sea, though its waters roar and foam, though the mountains tremble with its tumult. There is a river whose streams make glad the city of God. And did you know that underneath this sanctuary, underneath this church, there are two creeks, underwater watersheds that come together, that merge, that are here under this ground? There's a river whose streams make glad the city of God, the holy habitation of the Most High. God is in the midst of the city. It shall not be moved. God will help it when the morning dawns. The nations are in an uproar. The kingdoms totter. God utters a voice. The earth melts. The God of hosts is with us. The God of Jacob is our refuge. So come, behold the works of God. Our house shelter on our campus is the hospitality of Christ in the midst of our city, offering emergency shelter to families who find themselves without housing. Come, behold the works of God. Every Sunday night, Urban Mission Community Partners feeds 100 plus hungry people a hot meal, gives out hygiene kits and foodstuffs to the families in that neighborhood, just about a mile away from us. Come, behold the works of God. Hope Partners, whose offices are in our building, and they've been operating during this entire pandemic stay-at-home time. They operate the shelter, they connect people to housing they can afford, they operate 4 major food banks in our region. God is in the midst of the city. Our congregation is in relationship with leaders of other institutions, primarily faith communities in the Inland Empire, in Los Angeles and San Bernardino counties. And together we're building power to address the systemic issues that create hungry people, that create unsheltered people. It's important to help people in the midst of their crisis. It's also important to ask, why? Why are people hungry and unsheltered? And what can we do about that? So we work with ICON institutions, Inland Community Organizing Network. And we do this with other organizations like ICON throughout the state of California recently to help people who were left out of the CARES Act. Didn't get any help, nothing at all. Public health demands that we care for the whole public. You know, a virus does not check your ID. The Celtic imagination understands that creation, all of creation, is born of the very substance of God. And the doctrine of creation out of nothing, ex nihilo, is anathema to many spiritual traditions, including Celtic Christianity. The doctrine ex nihilo, creation out of nothing, as if it were magic, led to further disdain for the physical, increased subjugation of the physical world, became the philosophical and foundational support, theologically, for the Holy Roman Empire to subdue, conquer, enslave. Physical things in this worldview are inconsequential, void of substance, empty of God. And since the physical's empty of God, it's free to exploit it. That's the trajectory of ex nihilo thinking. Christianity has itself created much suffering in its history because of the theologies that were allowed to develop. Paradoxically, this is where the story of Jesus invites us to participate fully in what is sacred, and that's everything. Even in the pain and the misery, especially in the pain and the misery, Our Christian faith teaches God is in the midst of our suffering. This is one of the realities of the cross. It's a paradox. Make no mistake. Yeah, there's tremendous suffering in the city, but there is tremendous suffering in the rural and beautiful landscapes of our state and country. The opioid crisis began in the rural portions of our country. I had colleagues 10 years ago who were talking about the opioid crisis in rural Kentucky. Richard Rohr is a theologian of our time, and he writes that we cannot jump over this world or its woundedness and still try to love God. We must love God through, in, with, and even because of this world. And that's the message that Christianity was supposed to initiate and proclaim and encourage. It's what Jesus modeled. The world and all that it is in it is not empty of God. Is not empty of God. Emptiness is a state of being we try to avoid, but there can also be a fullness in it. There's also a fullness in what we might think of as emptiness. It's a paradox. In music, notes that look empty, that are not filled in, they're held longer, they're fuller. They are full of sound, reverberating longer, enduring to be heard. There is in silence often a deep and abiding presence and aliveness. We get mixed up about what is really empty and what is really full. When a group of people are quiet together on purpose, there's an energy, there's an aliveness that is deeply sacred, infinitely full. This is one of the many things I miss in this space. And when we gather together in the midst of this city, in the midst of this sanctuary, and together we tune our hearts to God's love, something inexplicable happens. Maybe not every week, but very often it does. And the silence becomes so full, so alive with God. The motion and the movement of Psalm 46, it shifts radically at the end. We start in the midst of divine and human activity. The mountains shake in the heart of the sea, and the nations are in an uproar. And suddenly comes the call, the invitation. Be still and know that I am God. Suddenly we are directly addressed by God. Be still and know that I am God. It is understandable that people want to return to some kind of normalcy in this pandemic. But what was normal? I think it was mostly distraction and distancing from the problems that plague our society all the time. It's understandable that even people of faith want to return to a sanctuary of their own making, to distract and distance from the reality that we will be in this for some time. I hope I'm wrong, but we're going to be in this for a while. This time is a call to be still and know, to quiet down and listen for God. Be still and know that I am God. This is the orienting polar star, if you will, of our journey. The call of this season, if we will hear it, is to reorient our way to the way of Jesus, who wasn't distracted away from the problems of his time, who did not distance himself from the pain of the world. He answered God's invitation to be still and know God in everyone and in everything. Can we?